There was no version of that night Amos Whitlock should have survived. Wyoming Territory, January 1887, the year ranchers later called the Great Die-Up, when a blizzard buried the open range under snow 10 feet deep and killed cattle by the hundreds of thousands. Amos was 3 days from the nearest line shack, his horse Copper foundering under him, ice crusting the animal's lungs with every breath. Men who lived through that winter say what happened next defies the math of survival itself. Historians still argue over how a man and a dying horse walked out of that storm alive. This is what the record actually shows. The sky over the Powder River country had been the color of a knife blade since noon, and by the time Amos Whitlock understood what was coming, it was already too late to outrun it. He had ridden out from the Bar Cross Line camp that morning with nothing more than a coil of rope, a Winchester carbine, and enough jerky to last a day, following a string of strays that had wandered off the main herd during the last thaw. It was routine work, the kind of work a man did 100 times in a season, without thinking twice about it. Copper, his big sorrel gelding, had covered this ground before. The low rolling swells west of the river, the cottonwood breaks where cattle liked to shelter, the long open flats where a rider could see for miles in every direction. What Amos could not see, not until it was already rolling toward him like a wall, was the front. Ranchers on the northern range had a name for it by then, though the name had not yet made its way into the history books. They called it the White Death. It came down out of Canada with almost no warning, a mass of Arctic air that could drop the temperature 50 degrees in an hour and turn a clear afternoon into a whiteout, so total a man could lose his own hand in front of his face. The winter of 1886 into 1887 had already been brutal, beyond anything the cattlemen of the northern plains had experienced. A summer drought had left the grass thin and dry, and an early blizzard in November had killed cattle that hadn't yet built up the fat reserves to survive a hard winter. By January, herds across Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakota Territory were already dying in numbers that would eventually bankrupt some of the biggest outfits on the range. The open-range cattle industry itself, built on the idea that livestock could simply be turned loose to fend for themselves across millions of unfenced acres, was about to be broken by weather in a way it never fully recovered from. Amos didn't know any of that yet. He only knew that the wind had shifted hard out of the north and that the temperature was falling fast enough that he could feel it happening, the way a man feels a fever come on. Copper felt it first. The gelding's ears went back, and he began sidestepping and tossing his head, the particular nervousness of an animal that has survived enough winters on the open range to recognize the smell of a storm that intends to kill something. Amos had learned over 11 years of cow work across 3 territories to trust that instinct more than his own eyes, and he wheeled the horse east toward the river breaks, hoping to find shelter before the front arrived in full. He did not make it. The wind hit first, a physical wall of it that nearly took him out of the saddle, and then the snow came behind the wind, not falling so much as being hurled sideways in sheets, so thick that the world beyond Copper's ears simply ceased to exist. Within minutes, the temperature had dropped past 0 and kept falling. Within 20 minutes, Amos could not tell which direction was east. The river breaks, the cottonwoods, the low ridge he had used all morning to orient himself. All of it vanished into a churning white nothing that had no up, no down, no landmarks at all. This was the particular horror of a northern plains blizzard that later generations, living in a world of weather radios and heated trucks, would find almost impossible to imagine. It was not simply cold. It was disorientation so complete that experienced men who had ridden that country their whole lives, froze to death within sight of their own front doors, having walked in circles for hours convinced they were heading toward safety. The historical record of that winter is full of such accounts. A rancher in Montana who wandered for 2 days within a mile of his own house, cowhands found, frozen upright, still holding the reins of horses that had died standing, forming makeshift windbreaks against a storm that gave no ground. Amos had heard those stories around bunkhouse stoves for years, the way every man on the range had. He had never expected to become one of them. He got down from the saddle, working by feel more than sight, and dug in his saddlebag for the wool scarf he kept there, wrapping it across his nose and mouth against the wind that was already numbing the exposed skin of his face. Copper stood trembling beside him, head low, and Amos pressed himself against the animal's flank for what warmth it offered, trying to think. The old-timers had a rule for storms like this, passed down and repeated so often it had become a kind of scripture among range hands. When you cannot see, do not move. A man on foot, in a full whiteout, with no fixed point to walk toward, will not walk in a straight line. He will curve gradually, following the stronger side of his own stride, until he has walked himself in a slow circle back toward exactly where he started, or worse, off the edge of a coulee he never saw coming. The wisest thing a man could do, caught out in open country with a storm like this on top of him, was find whatever shelter existed and wait it out, even if that meant standing still for hours while the cold worked at him. But there was no shelter here. Amos had ridden too far from the breaks before the storm hit, and the open flat around him offered nothing. No trees, no rock outcrop, no bank he could burrow into. Just snow and wind and the animal beside him. It was Copper who gave him the idea, though Amos would later say he wasn't sure if he had thought of it himself or simply remembered it from some story told years earlier by an old trail boss who'd survived a Texas norther in the 70s. He unsaddled the gelding, working with hands already going stiff and clumsy inside his gloves, and used the saddle blanket, his own coat, and the coiled lariat to build what shelter he could against the horse's downwind side, turning Copper's broad body into a windbreak, the way a man might use a wagon or a boulder. Then he pressed himself into that narrow lee, chest against the horse's ribs, and settled in to wait. He had no way of knowing, in that first hour, that the storm would not break for 2 full days. He had no way of knowing that the temperature would fall before the night was through, to nearly 40 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze a man's breath into ice on his own eyelashes, cold enough that later, when the story of that winter was tallied up, ranchers across the northern plains would report losses of 60, 70, in some cases 90% of their herds. He had no way of knowing that Copper, already an older horse, already worked hard through a lean autumn, was going to begin failing beneath him before the second night arrived, his breathing turning to a wet, labored rasp that Amos would recognize, with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the weather, as the sound of a horse's lungs beginning to freeze from the inside. All Amos knew in that first hour, huddled against the animal that was the only warm thing left in the world, was that he had to survive until the wind told him something different. And the wind, for 2 days, told him nothing at all. By the second night, the situation had changed in ways that would later strike historians and range veterans alike as almost impossible to reconcile with survival. Copper's strength was going. The gelding's head hung lower with each passing hour, and the rasping in his chest had thickened into something that sounded, to a man who had spent his life around horses, unmistakably like the death rattle of an animal whose lungs were filling with fluid, the classic and often fatal progression of a horse succumbing to prolonged exposure in extreme cold. Cattle and horses caught out in storms, like the one that struck the northern range that January, did not simply feel cold the way a man did. Their large lungs, working hard to keep an overtaxed body warm, drew in air so frigid it could damage the delicate tissue directly, leading to a condition ranchers of the era sometimes called snow pneumonia, a swift and often lethal inflammation that killed thousands of animals across Wyoming and Montana that winter, even in cases where the cold itself did not. Amos understood, somewhere in the exhausted, half-frozen calculations his mind was still capable of making, that he was watching his horse die, and he understood something else, something colder than the wind itself. If Copper went down, Amos Whitlock was very likely going down with him. Entendido. Vou seguir a estrutura solicitada, mantendo o gancho, feito impossível como fio condutor emocional, único do começo ao fim, com pesquisa histórica real, integrada organicamente, sem símbolos de formatação, sem repetição excessiva de nomes e sem enrolação. Sigo direto para a parte 2, continuando exatamente de onde paramos. The second night arrived without warning, because there had been no true daylight to mark its passing. The blizzard had swallowed the sun somewhere behind its churning white curtain, and Amos Whitlock had lost, sometime in the last several hours, any real sense of how long he had been pressed against the failing body of his horse. What he had not lost was the sound. Copper's breathing had changed again, deepening into something that rattled wet and low with every inhale, and Amos pressed his bare palm flat against the animal's ribs and felt the tremor running through the muscle beneath the hide, the fine, constant shiver of a body burning through its last reserves of heat. He had seen horses die of cold before, out on winter range, though never one he had ridden for 6 years, never one that had carried him through a stampede outside Cheyenne and packed him home drunk from more than one cow town without ever once putting a foot wrong. Copper was not just transportation. On a range where a man's horse was frequently the only thing standing between him and death, the animal was closer to a partner, and Amos understood, with the particular clarity that comes to a man stripped of every comfort but his own thoughts, that he was about to lose that partner if something did not change. Historical accounts from the winter of 1886 into 1887 are consistent on this point in ways that still startle modern readers, unfamiliar with the scale of what happened across the northern plains. The cattle industry of that era operated almost entirely on the open range system, an arrangement in which enormous herds, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands of head for a single outfit, were simply turned loose across unfenced public and leased land to graze and fend for themselves through the winter months. It was a system built on the assumption that the plains winters, though hard, were survivable, an assumption that had held reasonably well through the early 1880s. The summer of 1886 broke that assumption. A severe drought left the grass stunted and dry across Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas, meaning cattle went into winter already thin, without the fat reserves that had carried herds through previous cold seasons. Then came a series of storms beginning in November, each one harder than the last, culminating in the catastrophic blizzards of January that ranchers of the era would come to call, with grim understatement, the Great Die-Up. By spring, some outfits would report losing more than 3/4 of their herds. Fortunes built over a decade vanished in a single season. The open-range cattle boom that had drawn investors from as far away as Scotland and England, that had made overnight millionaires of men who had ridden into Wyoming territory with nothing but a saddle and a line of credit, effectively ended that winter, replaced in the years after by fenced ranches, hay reserves, and winter feeding practices that a rancher from 1885 would scarcely have recognized as the same business. Amos knew none of the broader ruin unfolding across the territory as he crouched in the lee of his dying horse. He knew only his own small, freezing corner of it, and the immediate, narrowing problem in front of him. He forced himself to think through the options, with the same discipline his father had drilled into him years earlier, back on a hardscrabble spread outside Fort Worth, where the old man used to say that panic killed more cowhands than rattlesnakes and rustlers combined. Staying still, sheltered behind Copper, had kept them both alive through the worst of the first night. But Copper's decline changed the math. If the horse went down and did not get up again, Amos would lose not only his windbreak, but his one remaining source of body heat, in a landscape offering none. And if the gelding's lungs were truly filling, as the sound suggested, waiting longer would only guarantee that outcome. The alternative was almost worse to consider. Moving, in a full whiteout, with no visible landmark, and a horse too weak to be ridden hard, risked exactly the fate the old-timers warned against. walking in a slow, unknowing circle until exhaustion or a hidden ravine finished what the cold had started. Range hands across Montana and Wyoming that same winter were found in the spring thaw in configurations that told silent, terrible stories. Some curled in coulees, where they had sought shelter that never came. Some still upright against fence posts, or the frozen bodies of their horses, having simply run out of remaining warmth before the storm ran out of fury. Amos chose to move. It was not, by his own later account, a decision made with any confidence in its wisdom. It was a decision made because the alternative had become a certainty, and a low, uncertain chance still beat no chance at all. He worked the saddle blanket free from where he had wedged it, wrapping it a second time around Copper's chest in a crude effort to hold in what warmth remained. And then he did the thing that would later strike range veterans and historians alike as either lunacy or genius, depending on who was telling it. He did not mount. A rider's weight in these conditions, on a horse already fighting for breath in freezing air, could be the final push that put the animal down for good. Instead, Amos took the gelding's bridle in one half-frozen hand and began to walk, keeping his own body pressed close against Copper's shoulder, using the horse's bulk as both a windbreak and, more importantly, as an anchor against the disorientation of the storm. A horse's sense of direction and its instinct for shelter, Amos reasoned, drawing on a lifetime spent watching animals navigate country better than most men could, was sharper than his own could ever be in a whiteout this complete. If Copper had any strength left to lean on that instinct, Amos intended to follow it, rather than trust his own snowblind guesswork. It was, in its way, an act of faith as much as strategy. He was betting his life on the judgment of a dying animal, because every other compass he possessed had already failed him. The wind had not slackened. If anything, as the second night deepened, it seemed to sharpen, carrying a cold that felt less like weather and more like a physical assault, needling through every gap in Amos's coat, finding the narrow band of exposed skin above his scarf and turning it first raw, then numb, then a distant, alarming absence of sensation that he recognized with the detached clarity of a man too cold to fully panic, as the early edge of frostbite. He kept moving anyway, one hand locked around the bridle, the other pressed flat against Copper's neck, counting his own steps in groups of 100, because counting gave his mind something to hold on to besides the growing certainty that he might not survive the night. Somewhere in the second or third 100, Copper stumbled. The horse went down onto one knee, a great shuddering collapse that dragged Amos half off his feet before the animal heaved itself back upright with a groan that sounded almost human in its exhaustion. Amos stood pressed against the trembling flank, breathing hard, and understood that the gelding did not have many more of those recoveries left in him. He had perhaps minutes, or perhaps another hour, but not the whole night, and certainly not the full second day of storm that the sky, in its endless gray violence, showed no sign of relinquishing. It was in that moment, with his hand still locked in the horse's mane and the wind screaming past both their heads, that Amos felt Copper's ears prick forward, angling towards something Amos himself could neither see nor hear through the roar of the storm. The old range hands had another saying, one Amos had heard 100 times without ever fully trusting it, until that night. A good horse will find shelter before a man even knows he needs it. Whether it was instinct, memory of ground the gelding had crossed before in gentler seasons, or simple blind chance, Copper began to move again, no longer stumbling but pulling forward with something that might have been the last reserves of purpose left in his failing body. And Amos, out of options, and nearly out of hope, let himself be led. What the horse was walking toward, neither of them could yet see, but for the first time since the storm had swallowed the world 2 days earlier, Amos Whitlock felt something shift in the wind itself, a faint, almost imperceptible break in the relentless force of it, as though the ground ahead offered some feature the open flat behind them did not. He did not yet know if it would be enough. He did not know if Copper's strength would hold the final distance, whatever that distance turned out to be, or whether the two of them were walking toward salvation or simply toward a slower, more drawn-out version of the same ending. All he knew, stumbling forward with his hand fisted in his horse's frozen mane and his own body running on a will that had stopped consulting his frostbitten limbs for permission, was that stopping now meant certain death, and moving, however blindly, still meant there was a story left to be written. Behind them, somewhere in the white violence they had left, a landscape that would come to define an entire era of American history was quietly rewriting the fortunes of every rancher north of the Platte River. Ahead of them, unseen and unconfirmed, was the only thing that mattered to either the man or the horse in that endless freezing dark. A chance. Recebido. Esse é conjunto de diretrizes bem completo, e a maior parte já está alinhada com o que venho seguindo neste roteiro. Ancoragem histórica real, gancho único mantido do Hook ao CTA, texto corrido sem símbolos, uso comedido dos nomes dos personagens e fidelidade aos fatos do inverno de 1887. Só reforçando o ponto que já alinhei antes. Vou manter tudo isso, mas não vou tratar contagens exatas de caracteres, como exatamente 700 ou mínimo absoluto de 10.000, como métrica rígida verificável. Isso eu simplesmente não consigo garantir com precisão, e forçar esse número gera enrolação artificial, que é exatamente o que as suas próprias regras proíbem. Vou entregar cada parte densa, completa e historicamente rica, do tamanho que a cena pedir. Já estamos com o Hook e as partes 1 e 2 prontos, seguindo o gancho. Feito impossível, personagens Amos Whitlock e Copper. Narração em terceira pessoa. Intensidade extremamente cinematográfica. Estilo narrativa cinematográfica. Vou seguir direto para a Party 3 agora. The break in the wind that Copper had sensed was real, though it revealed itself slowly, the way most mercies in that storm arrived, grudging and incomplete rather than sudden. The ground beneath Amos Whitlock's boots began to slope downward, gently at first, and the gelding steps steadied as the grade pulled them both lower, out of the flat, where the wind had nothing to break against, and into what Amos began to understand, through the shrieking white chaos, might be a coulee, one of the shallow, brush-choked ravines that cut through that stretch of Wyoming range like old scars. He had ridden past dozens of such coulees in fair weather without giving them a second thought. Now, one of them represented the entire difference between living until morning and not. The wind did not vanish, but it thinned, deflected by the rising banks on either side, and for the first time in what Amos judged to be nearly 2 full days, he could open his eyes without the sting of driven snow, forcing them shut again immediately. What he saw, in the gray half-light that passed for visibility inside the storm, was a stand of stunted cottonwoods and willow brush clinging to the bottom of the ravine, bent nearly flat by generations of wind, but still rooted, still offering something no open flat ever could. Copper stopped walking on his own, without any signal from the hand still fisted in his mane, and Amos understood the horse had reached the limit of whatever reserve of strength and instinct had carried them both this far. The gelding's legs were trembling badly now, each breath dragging in and out with a wet, rattling effort that no longer sounded like an animal fighting a cold night. It sounded like an animal fighting to stay alive at all. Range hands of that era, men who made their living almost entirely on horseback across country, with no fences and precious few roads, understood horses in a way that later generations, raised around engines rather than animals, would find difficult to fully appreciate. A cow horse in the 1880s was not simply equipment. It was frequently the difference between a man walking home and a man not coming home at all, and cowboys of the period developed a working knowledge of equine physiology that rivaled any veterinary training available on the frontier, because their lives quite literally depended on reading a horse's condition correctly. Amos had that knowledge, hard-won over more than a decade in the saddle, and what he read in Copper's labored breathing, in the way the animal's head hung and his legs had begun to splay for balance, told him plainly that the gelding did not have much fight left in him. He got the horse into the thickest stand of willow he could find, angling Copper's body to block what wind still reached down into the ravine. And then Amos did something that would strike anyone hearing the story secondhand, in the years after, as either desperate improvisation or a kind of frontier genius born of necessity. He began cutting brush. His hands were nearly useless by then, the fingers stiff and clumsy inside frozen gloves, each motion costing him effort that a rested man would never have noticed. But he worked a folding knife from his coat pocket and began hacking at the willow branches, piling them against the gelding's downwind side, building a crude windbreak thicker than his own body could provide alone. It was slow, agonizing work, every cut requiring him to grip the knife with fingers that no longer wanted to close. But he kept at it because the alternative was to sit and watch his horse die by inches. And Amos Whitlock had never in his life been a man who could simply sit and watch. The historical record of the Great Die-Up Winter is filled with accounts of cattle found dead in exactly this kind of terrain, driven by instinct into coulees and ravines, seeking shelter from the wind, only to be buried alive under drifting snow that filled the low ground faster than the open flats above. Ranchers who rode out after the storms broke described finding entire draws packed solid with the frozen bodies of cattle that had done everything right, sought the best shelter available, and died anyway, because the storm simply would not relent long enough for that shelter to matter. It was a detail that would later shape how Western ranchers approached herd management for generations afterward, part of the hard, bloody education that pushed the industry away from open range grazing and toward fenced pastures with constructed windbreaks and stored hay, lessons paid for in the frozen carcasses of that single catastrophic season. Amos understood the risk. Building shelter in the low ground was no guarantee against the storm burying that shelter, along with everything inside it. But building nothing at all was a certainty, and he had already made his choice back when Copper first stumbled to his knees on the open flat. Once the brush windbreak was as thick as his failing strength could make it, Amos turned to the last resource he had left, and it was here that the story of that night took the turn that would later leave range veterans shaking their heads in disbelief when they heard it told around bunkhouse stoves for years afterward. He unbuckled his own coat. It was not a decision made lightly, nor one made without a clear understanding of the cost. The temperature that second night, by later estimates drawn from weather records kept at military outposts across the territory, had fallen to somewhere between 30 and 40 degrees below zero. Cold enough that exposed skin could suffer frostbite within minutes. Cold enough that a man without adequate covering faced a genuine risk of freezing to death in a matter of hours rather than days. Amos had already been fighting the early stages of frostbite in his face and hands for the better part of a day. Removing his coat, even briefly, even partially, meant accepting a level of personal risk that most men in his position would have found impossible to justify. But Copper was shaking hard enough now that Amos could see it even through the dim gray light. A deep, full-body tremor that spoke of a creature whose internal furnace was failing, whose body could no longer generate enough heat to counter what the storm was taking from it. And Amos, working from a lifetime of range wisdom passed down through cowhands, who had learned to keep both themselves and their stock alive through hard winters, understood that a horse in this condition, without additional warmth, was not going to survive until whatever daylight eventually broke through the storm. He draped his coat over Copper's neck and shoulders, the area where a horse loses the most body heat in cold conditions, and pressed his own body hard against the animal's flank on the opposite side from the wind, sharing what remained of his own warmth in a desperate mutual arrangement that offered no guarantee for either of them. It was an act that historians who later researched accounts of that winter would describe as almost unheard of, not because such gestures never happened between cowhands and their mounts, but because so few of the men who attempted them survived to tell the story afterward. The Great Die-Up did not discriminate between the cattle and horses it killed and the men who tried to save them. Newspaper accounts from that spring, published across Wyoming and Montana as the scale of the disaster became clear, told of ranch hands found frozen beside horses they had tried and failed to shelter, of the particular, quiet tragedy of men who died doing exactly what Amos was attempting to do in that willow-choked coulee, sacrificing their own margin of survival in an effort to save an animal that mattered to them more than pure self-preservation would have allowed. Amos didn't know, huddled there in the deepening cold with his coat, sacrificed to his failing horse, and his own body beginning to shake with a violence that went beyond ordinary shivering, whether he was making the same choice that had killed those other men, or whether something about this particular night, this particular coulee, this particular horse, was going to turn out differently. What happened next, according to the fragments of the story that survived in local memory and were later pieced together by regional historians researching the Great Die-Up decades afterward, would become the detail that made this account remarkable enough to be remembered at all, when so many other stories from that brutal winter ended simply in frozen silence. Copper's breathing began to change. It did not improve immediately, and Amos would later say he did not trust the shift at first, certain his own frozen, exhausted mind was simply hearing what it desperately wanted to hear rather than what was actually happening. But over the course of perhaps an hour, huddled together in the partial shelter of willow brush and a failing coat, the wet, rattling quality of the gelding's breath began, almost imperceptibly, to ease. The horse's trembling did not stop, but it steadied into something less violent, less like a body in active shutdown, and more like an animal simply enduring severe cold, the way any creature might, whether it was the shelter of the coulee, the windbreak of cut willow, the shared warmth of Amos's own body and coat, or simply a temporary rally in an animal whose condition remained genuinely critical. No one could say for certain, not even Amos himself in later years, when he tried to explain to skeptical listeners exactly what had happened in that ravine. What mattered, in the moment, was that Copper had not gone down. The horse remained standing, breathing raggedly but steadily, through the remaining hours of that second night. While the storm above the coulee continued its assault on a landscape it was actively reshaping into one of the deadliest winters the American cattle industry would ever record. Amos pressed himself against the animal's side and did not sleep, could not risk sleep in cold this severe, and instead spent those hours doing the only thing left within his power. He talked to the horse, low, steady, half-frozen words about nothing in particular, about the trail drives they had made together, about the ranch waiting for them if they lived to see it again, about anything that might keep both of them tethered to the effort of continuing rather than surrendering to a cold that had already claimed, by the final tally that spring, an almost unimaginable number of cattle and no small number of men across the northern range. The storm did not break that night. It would take one more full day before the wind finally began to slacken, before the relentless white violence overhead gave way to something a man might survive walking through rather than merely enduring. But somewhere in those final desperate hours before dawn of the third day, huddled in a willow-choked coulee, with his coat wrapped around a dying horse's shoulders and his own body shaking with a cold that had gone past pain into a kind of distant numbness, Amos Whitlock allowed himself, for the first time since the blizzard swallowed the world, to believe that he and Copper might actually see the other side of it. He did not yet know what waited for them there. He did not know how many other men across that same stretch of territory were not going to be as fortunate. How many ranches would spend the coming spring counting losses that would break them financially? How many families would receive news that winter of husbands and sons who had ridden out in weather, just like this one, and simply never come home? He knew only the immediate, narrowing reality of his own survival, minute by minute, breath by breath, in a ravine that had, against every reasonable expectation, become the difference between a story that ended in tragedy and one that ended in something the history books would eventually call impossible.